The funeral bell tolls, but for Amina, the sound is merely a dull thud against the glass of her reality. She stands in the back of the cold Seoul chapel, her feet rooted to the stone floor while the rest of the room drifts in a haze. Every strike of the bell vibrates through her chest, a rhythmic reminder of the man lying in the mahogany box. She reaches into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a small, crumpled piece of paper. The medical test result is still there, confirming the life growing inside her, a secret that makes the air feel thin. She pulls her hand away, forcing her knuckles to relax. Across the room, the scent of lilies is suffocating. Amina shifts her gaze toward the front row. There sits Min-jun, now gone. Beside him, his wife Ji-won sits carved from ice. She is an outsider, a ghost in the periphery, and the weight of the paper in her pocket feels heavier than the silence. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Amina stands near the rear exit, her presence a stark, silent contrast to the muted grays and blacks of the congregation. Her skin tone stands out against the pale, sterile walls of the room, marking her as a stranger in this landscape of grief. She remains perfectly still, her shoulders pulled back, refusing to let the heavy atmosphere dictate her composure. The mahogany coffin sits on a raised dais, its surface reflecting the dim, artificial glow of the overhead chandeliers. Amina watches the mourners. They move with a practiced, collective sorrow that she cannot replicate. She feels the eyes of the room grazing over her, but she does not flinch. She is not here to mourn with them. She takes a slow, measured step forward, the sound of her heel clicking against the stone floor, cutting through the low hum. Amina retreats into the narrow gap between the heavy velvet curtains and the wall. The space is tight, smelling of dust and stale incense. She slides her hand into her pocket, fingers trembling as they grip the crumpled paper. She pulls it out just enough to catch the sliver of light. The ink is smudged, but the words remain clear. Positive. The test result is a cold, clinical fact that defies the surrounding atmosphere of death. She stares at the date, her thumb tracing the embossed seal of the clinic. The realization hits her with physical force, a sudden tightening in her chest that makes it hard to draw a full breath. She is not just here to mourn, she is carrying a living, breathing secret. She folds the paper back into a tight square, the sharp edges digging into her palm. Her heart beats against her ribs, a frantic rhythmic thud. She presses her back against the cold wood of the wall, closing her eyes for a second to steady her hands. When she opens them, the chapel looks different. The mourners are no longer just people. They are obstacles. She tucks the report deep into her pocket, her jaw set, and prepares to face the front of the room. Amina shifts her gaze from the shadows to the front of the chapel. A framed photograph rests on an easel near the coffin, capturing a moment of stillness that feels impossible now. She focuses on the image. The sharp, familiar lines of his face pull her back 2 years. She remembers the way he would lean against the brick wall of the small cafe where they met, his eyes always scanning the street for her arrival. She recalls the exact texture of his skin against her palm, the warmth of his hand, and the way he would lower his voice to a whisper whenever they were in public. They had built a world in the margins of his life, a secret architecture of stolen afternoons and quiet conversations. In the photo, he looks at the camera with a confidence that she rarely saw when they were alone. She traces the curve of his jaw in her mind, remembering the specific scent of rain and cedar that always clung to him. The memory is vivid, almost tactile, cutting through the sterile air of the chapel like a physical presence. But then, the reality of the mahogany box pulls her back. The man in the photo is a ghost, and the man in the box is a finality she is not ready to accept. She blinks, the image blurring as the chapel lights shift. Amina pulls her focus from the photograph and scans the front row. The air in the chapel seems to thin as she spots the woman sitting beside the empty space where Min-jun should have been. Ji-won sits with an unnatural stillness, her posture perfectly vertical. She does not lean, she does not fidget, and she does not look at the coffin. Her presence acts as a vacuum, drawing the focus of every person in the room toward her. Amina watches as Ji-won turns her head. The movement is slow, deliberate, and devoid of any warmth. Her Her skin appears pale against the dark surroundings, and her hair falls in a sharp, straight line that frames her face like a mask. There is no tremor in her hands, no moisture in her eyes. She radiates a calculated, clinical power that makes the surrounding mourners seem small and chaotic by comparison. When Ji-won finally stands, the rustle of the crowd dies out instantly. She does not look at the mourners. She looks through them. Her gaze sweeps across the chapel, landing on the mahogany box with the same detached interest one might give a discarded object. Amina feels the weight of that gaze even from the back of the room. It is a cold, precise intensity that suggests she is not here to grieve, but to preside over the end of something she no longer finds useful. The atmosphere in the chapel shifts. It is no longer a place of mourning, but a confined space where the air itself seems to thicken with intent. Amina feels the change against her skin, a prickling sensation that warns her of an unseen threat. She watches Ji-won, whose stillness is not the result of grief, but of absolute control. The malice radiating from the front row is palpable, a heavy, suffocating pressure that pushes against Amina's chest. Her breath hitches, a sharp, involuntary sound that she stifles instantly by pressing her hand over her mouth. She realizes then that she is not a participant in this funeral. She is an intruder in a game she does not yet understand. The room feels smaller, the walls closing in as the whispers of the crowd fade into a dull, rhythmic hum. Amina takes a half-step backward, her heel catching on the edge of a floorboard. She winces, forcing herself to remain motionless until the sound is swallowed by the ambient silence. She retreats further into the dim periphery of the chapel, sliding her back against the cold stone of the rear wall. She is now entirely in the shadows, hidden from the sightlines of the front row. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that she struggles to dampen. She is trapped, watching the woman at the podium, waiting for the next move in a sequence that feels increasingly lethal. Ji-won rises from the front pew. She moves with a fluid, predatory grace that makes the wooden floorboards seem to yield under her feet. Every head in the chapel turns, tracking her path toward the center of the room. She does not acknowledge the sea of mourners. Her eyes are locked on the mahogany podium ahead. She reaches the stand and places her palms flat against the polished wood. The impact is soft, yet the sound resonates through the vaulted ceiling like a gavel strike. She leans forward, her weight shifting onto her wrists, her spine perfectly straight. Around her, the murmurs of the congregation evaporate. The air in the chapel turns stagnant, heavy with a sudden, suffocating pressure that makes it difficult to draw a full breath. Even the distant sound of rain against the stained glass seems to mute, leaving only the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the people in the rows. Ji-won remains motionless, her fingers splayed across the wood, her knuckles pale. She waits. She lets the silence stretch until it becomes a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. The silence in the chapel is absolute, a vacuum that pulls at the senses. Ji-won does not rush. She stands anchored to the podium, her gaze sweeping across the rows of mourners with a clinical, detached precision. She draws a slow, measured breath, the sound of her inhalation amplified by the stillness of the room. Then, she clears her throat. The sound is dry, sharp, and startlingly loud, echoing against the stone walls like a sudden crack in a frozen lake. She pauses, letting the vibration of that sound settle into the bones of everyone present. She tilts her head slightly, her expression remaining entirely unreadable. Her eyes find a focal point in the middle distance, not looking at anyone, yet commanding the attention of everyone. She opens her mouth, her lips parting with deliberate slowness. "I have an announcement to make," she says. Her voice is not loud, but it possesses a cutting, metallic quality that slices through the heavy air. The words hang in the space between the pews, sharp as a blade, immediately altering the trajectory of the mourning. Amina stands in the furthest row, her breath hitching as the announcement echoes off the vaulted ceiling. The words hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to retreat a half-step into the shadows of the rear archway. She feels the eyes of the mourners, even though they are all fixed on the front, and the sensation of being an intruder becomes overwhelming. She reaches out, her fingers finding the rough, cold grain of the wooden pew in front of her. She digs her nails into the wood, squeezing until the pressure radiates up her forearms. Her knuckles turn white. She is a stranger here, a ghost in a room full of people who share a history she can never claim. The air feels thinner, harder to pull into her lungs, and she realizes that her presence is a liability. She shifts her weight, trying to make herself smaller, trying to vanish into the dim light of the back wall. Ji-won does not blink. She holds the silence for 3 heartbeats, her gaze tracking slowly across the front rows, lingering just long enough on each face to suggest she is searching for a reaction. Her hands remain flat against the wood, fingers splayed, unmoving. When she speaks again, the tone has shifted, losing its formal edge and hardening into something jagged and dangerous. "My husband did not die of natural causes," she declares. The sentence is short, stripped of any ornamentation. She pauses, letting the weight of the word poisoned settle into the room like a toxic fog. "He was taken from us by someone in this very room," she continues, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Someone who thought they could steal his legacy by ending his life." The implication hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amina feels the blood drain from her face. The reality of the accusation hits her with the force of a physical impact. She knows the truth behind those words, and the danger of her position becomes absolute. The room remains unnervingly still, the air thick with the sudden, sharp scent of impending violence. The silence shattered. It started as a low, collective intake of breath, then fractured into 1,000 overlapping whispers. Heads turned, not toward the podium, but toward one another. Eyes narrowed, scanning faces for signs of guilt or hidden knowledge. A man in the 3rd row stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor, the sound cutting through the murmurs like a knife. He shouted a question that was immediately drowned out by a wave of frantic, panicked chatter. People were no longer mourners, they were suspects. The air grew thick with the friction of shifting bodies and frantic movement. Amina watched as the orderly rows of the chapel dissolved. Some guests gripped their seats, knuckles white, while others began to edge toward the aisles, looking for an exit. The temperature in the room seemed to spike. Every glance felt like an accusation, and every hushed word carried the weight of a threat. The chapel had become a pressure cooker of paranoia. Amina felt the walls closing in as the crowd surged. She knew she could not stay in the center of this storm. Amina pressed her palm against her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed the chaos surrounding her. Each beat felt like a countdown. She looked toward the podium, but Ji-won was no longer looking at the crowd. She was scanning the perimeter, her gaze sharp and deliberate. Amina felt a cold prickle of sweat trace her spine. She knew the truth behind the murder, and that knowledge was now a death sentence. The paper in her pocket felt heavy, a weight that anchored her to a reality she could no longer escape. She realized then that the accusation was not just a distraction. It was a net. Ji-won was narrowing the field, eliminating everyone who knew the secrets of the family business. Amina's breath hitched, shallow and sharp. She looked down at her stomach, shielding it with a subtle shift of her arm. The danger had moved beyond her own survival. She was no longer just an observer in a room full of suspects. She was the primary target. The realization hit her with absolute, terrifying clarity. She had to leave, not just to find safety, but to protect the life growing inside her. She turned, her movements calculated, and began to weave through the panicked crowd toward the heavy chapel doors. The memory of their final meeting surfaced with brutal clarity. Min-jae had been a man hollowed out by constant surveillance. He had gripped her hand so hard his knuckles turned gray, his eyes darting toward the door of their secret apartment, as if expecting it to burst open. He told her then that Ji-won held his family's assets in a vice. Every bank account, every property deed, and every board vote was tied to her signature. He was not a husband. He was a hostage in his own home. He described how Ji-won would sit at the dinner table, watching him eat, detailing the exact ways she could ruin his parents if he ever stepped out of line. She had turned his life into a cage of legal threats and financial blackmail. He had whispered that she was not just protecting the business, she was consuming it, piece by piece, until nothing remained of his original legacy. He had been terrified of her silence, of the way she would wait for him to fail just so she could tighten the grip. Now, standing in this room, Amina understood the finality of his fear. His death was not a tragedy to Ji-won, but a necessary liquidation. Amina took the first step back, her heel catching on the edge of a floorboard. The sound was a sharp crack in the stifling silence of the chapel. She froze, her breath held tight in her throat, waiting for the room to turn toward her. No one looked. The crowd remained fixed on the podium, their attention held by the cold authority of the woman at the front. Amina pushed through the gap between two rows of wooden benches. Her skin felt pale, drained of blood, and her eyes darted toward the exit. The heavy oak doors seemed miles away. She bumped into a man standing in the aisle, his shoulder jarring against hers. He turned, eyes narrowing in annoyance, and Amina lowered her head, pulling her frame into the shadows of the pillars. Every second spent in the room felt like a gamble with her life. She reached the back wall and pressed her palms against the cold stone. With one final, desperate look at the back of Ji-won's head, she pushed the door open, slipping into the dark corridor beyond. The lobby was a gauntlet of black fabric and hushed, rhythmic murmurs. Amina moved through the throng, her vision narrowing to the space directly in front of her feet. Faces blurred into a singular, shifting wall of suspicion. A woman in a dark veil turned as Amina brushed past, her eyes lingering for a second too long, tracing the line of Amina's jaw. Amina kept her head down, her pulse thudding against her collarbone. Every muffled conversation sounded like a whisper about her presence. She dodged a group of men standing near the coat check, their voices dropping into a sharp, sudden silence as she passed. The air here was thick with the scent of lilies and damp wool. She quickened her pace, her boots clicking against the marble floor, each sound magnified by her own frantic heartbeat. She pushed past a pillar, her shoulder scraping the rough stone, and focused entirely on the sliver of gray light visible through the glass. The final set of double doors stood before her, a barrier of polished wood separating the suffocating interior from the open air. Amina reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold brass handle. She hesitated, a sudden sharp instinct pulling her gaze back toward the podium. Across the expanse of the room, the crowd remained a sea of bowed heads, but at the front, the movement was different. Ji-won had stopped speaking, her head tilted, her chin lifting as her eyes began a slow, methodical sweep of the back rows. Amina felt the air leave her lungs. The gaze moved closer, scanning the shadows where she stood, cold and deliberate. It was a predator marking territory. Amina did not wait for the eyes to lock onto her own. She twisted the handle, the mechanism clicking with a sound that seemed loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. She threw her weight against the door, the wood groaning as it swung outward. A sliver of gray, unfiltered daylight cut across the floor, blinding her for a heartbeat. She stepped through the frame, the heavy door swinging shut behind her with a final, hollow thud that cut off the murmurs of the chapel. She was out. The sky over Seoul had opened up, turning the world into a blur of gray streaks and slick, black asphalt. Rain hit Amina with the force of gravel, instantly soaking through her coat and chilling the skin beneath. She stumbled, her heel catching on the uneven edge of the sidewalk, but she caught her balance against a cold brick wall. The air tasted of exhaust and wet concrete, a sharp departure from the floral scent of the chapel. She stood there for a moment, chest heaving, watching the headlights of passing cars smear across the road like spilled paint. Every splash of a passing tire sounded like a footstep behind her. She pushed off the wall, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She turned into a narrow alleyway, the darkness here deeper, the rain muffling the distant hum of the city. Her boots skidded on a patch of oil-slicked gravel, but she didn't stop. The city was no longer a place of secrets. It was a labyrinth. Amina pressed her back against the rough brick of the alley, her hands trembling as she pulled the crumpled medical result from her pocket. The ink was blurring under the relentless rain, but the words remained etched in her mind. She looked down, her palm flattening against her stomach. For weeks, this had been a secret promise, a connection to the man she had lost. Now, The reality hit her with the force of a physical blow. This life inside her was not just a miracle. It was the ultimate threat to the dynasty Ji-won was desperate to protect. She realized then that the announcement in the chapel had not been for the mourners. It was a declaration of war. Ji-won was not grieving. She was clearing the board. Every shadow in the alley suddenly felt like a pair of eyes, and every distant siren sounded like a closing trap. Amina tucked the paper deep into her pocket, her fingers clenching into a fist. She was no longer a mourner seeking closure. She was a target, and the hunter was already on the move. She forced herself to breathe, steadying her shaking limbs. If she stayed here, she was dead. She had to move, to vanish, and to protect the only piece of him that remained. Itaewon surged around her, a chaotic pulse of neon blues and harsh magentas. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the streets were slick with reflected light. Amina pushed into the thick of the crowd, her head bowed to hide her face. The smell of grilled meat and ozone hung heavy in the air, clashing with the metallic tang of her own fear. She nearly collided with a group of laughing students, her shoulder slamming into a passerby. She muttered an apology and kept moving, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every neon sign felt like a spotlight, and every reflective window seemed to track her progress. She navigated by touch, her fingers trailing along damp concrete walls as she sought a route that avoided the main arteries. Amina stopped, her breath hitching as the cold metal of a key in her pocket pressed against her thigh. The sensation triggered a memory, sharp and sudden. It was 3 nights before the funeral. Min-jun had pulled her into the back corner of a quiet cafe, his hands shaking as he gripped her shoulders. He had not spoken of love that night. He had spoken of survival. He pressed the key into her palm, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the brass. "If anything happens, go to the station," he had whispered, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected to be watched. Locker 402. It is the only thing she cannot touch. She had tried to push it back, terrified by the weight of his paranoia, but he had forced her fingers shut over the metal. Now, standing in the damp silence of the alley, the memory hit her with absolute clarity. That key was not just a piece of brass. It was an insurance policy he had bought with his own life. She pulled it out, watching the dim street lamp light catch the worn edges. The terror that had paralyzed her moments ago began to harden into a cold, sharp resolve. She knew where she had to go. The subway entrance yawned before her, a concrete throat swallowing the city's noise. Amina stepped onto the escalator, the metal steps groaning under her weight. Below, the rhythmic, metallic screech of an arriving train vibrated through the soles of her boots, a low-frequency hum that matched the frantic thrumming in her chest. She kept her head down, counting the seconds as the platform lights flickered into view. A security guard stood near the turnstiles, his gaze sweeping over the late-night commuters. Amina slowed her pace, blending into the shadow of a departing passenger, her movements measured and quiet. She slipped through the gate, the plastic barrier clicking shut behind her. The air here was stale, heavy with the scent of ozone. She reached the main hall, the cold metal of the key still burning in her palm, and began to search for the row of lockers. The locker bay was a graveyard of rusted steel, tucked behind a concrete pillar. Amina rounded the corner, her boots clicking sharply against the floor. Rows of metal doors stretched into the gloom, each one marked with fading, stenciled numbers. She held the key tight, her knuckles white. The air smelled of damp concrete and stagnant air. She scanned the first row, but the numbers were scratched away, illegible under the grime. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the far end of the hall, and she ducked behind a pillar, holding her breath until the sound died away. It was only a maintenance cart, but the jolt of adrenaline left her hands trembling. She stepped back out, moving faster now, her eyes darting across the steel faces. She reached the second bank of lockers. The numbers here were clearer, painted in chipped black enamel. She began to trace them with her index finger, moving from left to right. 398, 399. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she neared the end of the line. She stopped, her breath hitching, as she realized she had miscounted the rows. She turned back, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a cluster of lockers further down, partially obscured by a stack of discarded crates. She moved toward them, the key ready in her hand. Amina stopped. The locker stood before her, its surface pitted with orange oxidation and deep, jagged scratches. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the cold, uneven metal, confirming the number etched into the frame. Just as she prepared to act, the fluorescent tube overhead groaned. It shuddered, a high-pitched electrical whine piercing the silence before it began to strobe. The light pulsed in erratic, violent bursts, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching fingers. Each flicker erased the world, then slammed it back into view, distorted and sharp. Amina stood frozen in the center of the bay, the rhythmic flashing turning the rows of lockers into a disorienting maze of light and void. The air grew thick with the ozone smell of a dying ballast. She pressed her back against the neighboring unit, her eyes darting to the dark corners of the station where the light failed to reach. She was entirely alone, trapped in the stuttering glare, staring at the rusted door that held the only leverage she had left in a city that wanted her gone. Amina stepped away from the wall, the flickering light casting her shadow long and distorted against the floor. She reached for the locker door, her hand hovering inches from the rusted surface. Her fingers were trembling, the skin pale against the dark, oxidized metal. She took a sharp, jagged breath, trying to force the panic back down into her chest. She brought the key up, her thumb pressing hard against the jagged edge of the metal. She aligned the teeth with the lock, but the key refused to slide in. It caught on a burr of rust, grinding against the internal pins. She pulled it back, wiped the sweat from her palm onto her side, and tried again. This time, she pushed with deliberate, slow pressure. The metal bit into the lock, sliding home with a heavy, satisfying resistance. She gripped the bow of the key, her knuckles white and twisted. The mechanism was stubborn, seized by years of neglect and damp air. She braced her shoulder against the locker, applied steady torque, and felt the internal tumblers shift. A loud, metallic click echoed through the empty station, sharp as a gunshot. The lock released. She stood there for a heartbeat, the key still held tight in her fist. Amina kept her fingers locked around the key, her breath shallow and rapid. She reached for the handle, a small rectangular piece of steel fused to the door by layers of oxidation. She pulled. It did not move. The metal felt frozen in place, a stubborn obstacle in a night defined by them. She braced her boots against the concrete floor, leaned back, and pulled again with everything she had. Her muscles strained, the tension vibrating through her arms and shoulders. The locker groaned, a long, high-pitched screech of metal against metal that seemed to shatter the quiet of the station. She shifted her grip, finding a better angle, and gave a final, desperate jerk. The door gave way, swinging outward with a sudden, jarring momentum that nearly threw her off balance. She stumbled back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The door hung open, a gaping rectangular void in the wall of lockers. It was dark inside, a deep, impenetrable shadow that seemed to swallow the flickering light. Amina leaned forward, her eyes straining to pierce the gloom inside the locker. She reached in, her fingers brushing against cold, flaking paint and grit. The space felt empty. A jolt of panic surged through her, a cold spike of adrenaline that made her fingers tremble. She pushed deeper, her arm disappearing up to the elbow into the dark cavity. Her fingertips tapped against something solid at the very back, a false panel. She pressed her thumb against the seam, finding a small, recessed latch. With a sharp tug, the panel popped forward, revealing a hidden compartment. Her breath hitched. Inside, resting on a bed of dust, lay a thick, leather-bound volume. She wrapped her fingers around the spine, the texture rough and worn. It was heavier than she expected, a dense, substantial weight that seemed to anchor her to the spot. She pulled it slowly into the light. The ledger was bound in dark, cracked material, the corners frayed. She held it against her chest, feeling the sharp edges of the cover press into her palms. This was the record of a dynasty, the physical proof of crimes. She stood in the flickering fluorescent glow, realizing the power she now possessed. Amina rested the ledger on the narrow metal shelf, her hands steadying the heavy, cracked cover. She flipped the first page. The paper was yellowed, brittle, and smelled of trapped humidity. Her eyes scanned the dense columns of figures, rows of offshore accounts and shell companies that blurred into a chaotic web of numbers. She adjusted the book, tilting it to catch the light. The flickering made the ink dance, forcing her to squint and trace the lines with a trembling index finger. She turned to the second page, then the third, her pace quickening. Near the bottom of the fourth sheet, a name caught her eye. It was written in a sharp, elegant hand, Ji-won. The signature was scrawled across a transfer authorization for millions in corporate assets. Beside it, the stamp of a defunct holding company. Amina's breath caught in her throat. The numbers were not just errors. They were evidence of a systematic looting of the family business. She looked at the signature again, the ink dark and uncompromising. She had the proof, and now she was the only one who knew the depth of the betrayal. The silence of the subway station was no longer empty. It was pressurized, heavy with the sound of her own rapid pulse. Amina froze, the ledger still open in her hands. Then it started. A rhythmic, deliberate tapping against the concrete floor echoed from the far end of the platform. Left, right, left, right. The sound was measured, precise, and entirely too confident for a late-night commuter. She pressed her back against the cold metal of the locker bank, holding her breath until her lungs burned. The footsteps stopped. A long, agonizing pause stretched through the station, broken only by the low hum of a distant transformer. She strained her ears, eyes darting toward the tunnel entrance. A soft scuff of leather on tile signaled movement again. This time, the pace was faster. The pursuer was no longer wandering. They were closing the distance with purpose. Amina felt the hair on her arms rise. She looked at the exit sign, its red glow casting a sickly hue over the platform. The footsteps grew louder, the metallic ring of heels striking the ground. The sound of a heavy door swinging open at the top of the stairs confirmed her worst fear. The hunt had begun in earnest. The heavy ledger felt like a block of ice against her ribs. Amina did not hesitate. She shoved the book deep into the space between her skin and the inner lining of her coat, pulling the edges tight to keep it from shifting. The weight was awkward, pulling at her shoulder, but she ignored the discomfort. She smoothed the fabric down, checking that no corner of the paper peeked out. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the top of the stairs, the sound of a heavy metal gate being kicked open. The intruder was inside the station. Amina pressed her palm against the cold locker door, using the momentum to push herself away from the wall. She moved with a low, crouched gait, keeping her weight on the balls of her feet to dampen the sound of her steps. She darted behind a row of concrete pillars, the rough stones scraping her shoulder. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to sprint at the slightest hint of detection. She glanced back once, seeing the silhouette of a figure emerging from the stairwell. She turned away, her breath shallow and silent, and slipped into the deeper darkness of the platform. Amina ducked into a narrow maintenance alcove, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and ozone. She pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving as she fought to keep her breathing rhythmic and silent. A few feet away, a cracked, grime-streaked mirror hung near a utility panel, reflecting the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the station. She caught her own image and froze. The woman staring back was pale, her features drawn tight by the relentless pressure. A smudge of dark grease streaked her cheek, and her hair was disheveled. Amina reached up, wiping the grime from her face. The terror that had clouded her gaze began to recede, replaced by a cold, steady spark of defiance. She was calculating. She straightened her posture, pulling her shoulders back until the weight of the ledger felt like a source of strength. She was ready to move again, and this time, the hunt would have to contend with a woman who had nothing left to lose. Amina pulled the ledger out just enough to see the dates and signatures stamped on the yellowed pages. These were not just numbers. They were the blueprints of a crime. She saw the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the names of high-ranking officials tied to Minjun's family business. Every entry was a nail in Ji-won's coffin. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not merely a mistress hiding from a vengeful widow. She was the only person on Earth holding the key to a dynasty's collapse. The power dynamic shifted instantly. If she reached the right hands, Ji-won's polished reputation would shatter into dust. Amina traced the ink of a signature, her fingers steadying as the implications took root. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was the architect of a reckoning. The ledger felt lighter now, no longer a burden but a weapon of absolute precision. She tucked the book back into her coat, feeling the sharp edge of the binding against her side. She understood the game now. Ji-won had the money, the influence, and the reach, but she lacked the one thing Amina possessed: the truth. Amina stepped out of the alcove, her stride measured and deliberate. She was no longer a target. She was the hunter. Amina pushed through the heavy metal exit doors, the humid night air hitting her like a physical weight. The subway entrance was quiet, but the street beyond hummed with the restless energy of the city. She took 3 steps toward the sidewalk when the screech of tires tore through the silence. A black sedan swerved from the flow of traffic, mounting the curb with a violent jolt. The headlights cut through the rain, blinding her for a split second. She saw the silhouette of a driver behind the tinted glass. The engine roared, a low, predatory growl that vibrated in her chest. Amina did not wait for the door to open. She pivoted on her heel, her boots slamming against the wet pavement as she sprinted toward the narrow mouth of a nearby alley. Behind her, the car door slammed shut. A man's voice barked an order that was swallowed by the downpour. She didn't look back. She turned a sharp corner, her feet sliding on the slick asphalt, and vanished into the shadows just as a heavy boot hit the ground behind her. Amina hit the main strip of Itaewon, the air thick with the smell of street food and the roar of music. She didn't run in a straight line. She moved like water, weaving through the dense wall of bodies. She ducked behind a vendor's stall, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. A few yards back, 2 men in dark jackets pushed through the crowd, their eyes scanning every face. Amina pressed her back against a brick wall, watching the reflection of the neon signs shimmer in the oil-slicked puddles at her feet. She saw their shadows stretch long and jagged against the pavement. She waited until a group of laughing tourists surged past, then stepped into the middle of them. She kept her head down, matching their pace, becoming just another silhouette in the neon-drenched chaos. The men passed within arm's reach, their shoulders brushing against the people she used as a shield. She didn't stop. She turned into a narrow side alley, her boots silent on the damp concrete. The noise of the main street faded into a dull thrum, replaced by the dripping of water from rusted pipes. She kept moving, deeper into the labyrinth, her grip on the ledger tightening with every step. The night market was a wall of steam and shouting. Amina dived into the narrow aisle, the heat of charcoal grills singing her skin. She kept her chin tucked, pushing through the thick press of shoppers. Suddenly, a man in a dark jacket emerged from the smoke 20 feet ahead, his gaze sweeping the stalls. Amina froze. She was trapped between a slow-moving family and a rack of hanging goods. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to betray her. She ducked her head, pivoting sharply into a stall selling textiles, her hands brushing against rough fabrics. She held her breath as the man moved closer, his boots crunching on discarded food wrappers. He stopped, his head turning toward the exact spot where she stood. Amina pressed her forehead against the cold metal frame of the stall, closing her eyes. The man stood there for a heartbeat, his shadow falling across her feet. Then, a vendor shouted a price, and the man turned, pushing past the stall to scan the next row. Amina didn't wait. She slipped out the back of the stall, her legs trembling, and vanished into the darker, quieter lanes beyond the market's edge. Amina leaned against the damp brick of a dead-end alley, the silence pressing in on her. She pulled the ledger from her inner pocket, the edges worn and sharp against her palm. It was heavy, a dense block of paper that felt like lead against her chest. She opened it just enough to catch the faint glow of a distant street lamp on the ink-stained pages. Names, dates, and bank codes stared back at her, a roadmap of a criminal empire. The weight of it was no longer just paper. It was a weapon. She traced the lines of the entries, her fingers steadying as the initial terror began to harden into something colder, sharper. She realized that Ji-won was not just hunting a woman, she was hunting a witness who held the keys to her destruction. Amina tucked the ledger back, pressing her hand firmly over the spot where it rested. The physical pressure of the book against her ribs served as a constant, rhythmic reminder of the power she now wielded. She was no longer running blindly. She was carrying the evidence that could dismantle a dynasty. She pushed off the wall, her stride lengthening, her eyes scanning the street ahead with a new, lethal focus. She was ready to strike back. Amina stepped out from the shadows of the alley into the wide expanse of the city square. The air felt different here, charged with the hum of neon and the restless movement of 1,000 commuters. She looked up, and the world seemed to tilt. A massive digital screen dominated the skyline, flickering to life with a high-definition feed. It was a press conference. Ji-won stood at a podium, her posture perfect, her face a mask of practiced grief. The audio boomed across the square, a hollow, echoing sound that made the pedestrians stop in their tracks. Ji-won spoke of justice, her voice smooth and steady, calling for the public to report any sightings of the person she claimed was responsible for the tragedy. Amina stood frozen, her gaze locked on the giant, projected eyes of her enemy. The widow's face was everywhere, on every glass surface, every billboard, every screen. It was a symbol of the reach and the malice Amina was fighting against. People around her pointed at the screen, murmuring about the injustice, unaware that the woman they were being told to fear was standing only feet away. Amina felt the cold reality of the hunt tighten around her. She was not just a witness anymore. She was the face of the enemy in the eyes of the entire city. The giant face on the screen loomed over the square, its eyes seemingly searching the crowd for her. Amina felt the air grow thin, her pulse hammering against her throat. She turned sharply, ducking into the narrow gap between two concrete buildings, away from the blinding glare of the billboards. The sudden darkness was absolute, a relief that allowed her to finally breathe. She prepped her back against the rough, cold cement, her hands trembling. Then, she reached down. She rested her palm flat against her stomach, feeling the slight, firm resistance of the life growing within. The tremor in her fingers stopped. The fear that had been clawing at her mind suddenly hit a wall of something harder, something primal. It was a surge of maternal strength, a heat that spread from her core to her limbs, grounding her in the present. She was no longer just a target in a game of power. She was a vessel for a future that Ji-won could never touch. The terror did not vanish, but it transformed into a focused, razor-sharp resolve. She stood up straight, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Amina moved through the periphery of the district, keeping to the edges where the streetlights flickered and died. The city noise, a constant roar of engines and sirens, began to fade as she climbed a steep, winding path leading away from the main thoroughfare. She reached a heavy wooden gate, weathered by time and partially obscured by overgrown ivy. She pushed against the wood, testing the resistance, and found it unlocked. She slipped inside. The transition was immediate. The roar of Seoul vanished, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water into a stone basin and the scent of burning incense. It was a small, ancient temple nestled between two glass skyscrapers, a relic of a different era. Amina walked across the gravel courtyard, her footsteps muffled by the thick, damp moss. She found a small alcove beneath the eaves of the main hall, sheltered from the wind and hidden from the view of the street above. She sat down, her back against the cool stone pillar, and let her muscles finally slacken. The silence here was not empty. It was a space to think. She pulled the ledger from her bag and laid it across her lap. The hunt was still happening outside these walls, but for the first time in days, she was the one holding the map. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady beat of her own heart. The ink on the pages of the ledger told a story of greed that reached far beyond the chapel walls. Amina memorized the names, the dates, and the offshore accounts until the evidence felt like a physical weight in her hands. She stood up, the stone floor cold beneath her feet, and tucked the ledger deep into her bag. The sanctuary had served its purpose. She could no longer hide. She pushed the heavy gate open and stepped back into the neon-drenched reality of Seoul. The city felt different now, no longer a labyrinth of traps, but a battlefield she understood. She moved through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows until she reached the district police station. The building stood like a fortress of light against the dark. She walked to the front desk, placed the ledger firmly on the counter, and met the officer's gaze without flinching. She watched as he opened the pages, his expression shifting from boredom to shock as the truth of the dynasty began to unfold. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. Amina stood on the pedestrian bridge, watching the traffic below begin its rhythmic pulse. The city, once a cage, now looked like a vast open map. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dropped it into a trash bin as she passed. The screen went dark, and the last digital link to her previous life vanished. She felt the cool air against her skin, no longer biting, but refreshing. There was no fear left, only the steady, quiet resolve of a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative. She reached the subway entrance, the familiar hum of the tracks rising to meet her. She did not look back at the district where the dynasty had fallen. She focused instead on the path ahead, the train lines stretching out toward the coast. Every step she took was lighter than the last. She placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the subtle, persistent life beneath her palm. The struggle was over. The road ahead was finally hers to walk. She descended the stairs, moving toward a horizon that held nothing but the promise of a new beginning. The train pulled away from the platform, the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel drowning out the lingering echoes of the city. Amina leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the concrete towers shrink into the distance until they were nothing more than jagged silhouettes against the morning sky. She closed her eyes, letting the steady motion of the carriage ground her. When she opened them again, the dense urban sprawl had given way to rolling green hills. The air inside the train felt cleaner, stripped of the tension that had defined her existence for so long. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook. She began to write. She documented the names, the dates, and the finality of her choice, turning the chaos of the past into a structured record of survival. Hours passed, the landscape shifting from industrial gray to the soft, muted colors of the coast. As the train slowed, she gathered her belongings. She stepped onto the platform, the scent of salt water filling her lungs. She walked toward the beach, the sand shifting beneath her feet. She was simply Amina, standing at the edge of a vast blue horizon, waiting for the life she had fought so hard to protect to finally begin. The small cottage stood at the end of a winding dirt path, weathered by the sea spray but sturdy against the wind. Amina turned the iron key in the lock, the mechanism clicking with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. She stepped inside, the scent of dried cedar and salt greeting her. She moved through the space, opening the shutters to let the light spill across the floorboards. There were no shadows here, only the steady, rhythmic wash of the tide against the cliffs below. She set her bag on the wooden table and walked to the kitchen. She boiled water for tea, the steam rising in lazy curls toward the ceiling. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, and entirely her own. She sat by the window, watching the sun dip toward the water, painting the horizon in shades of violet and gold. Her hand rested on her stomach, a gentle, protective weight. The ledger was hidden, the danger was miles behind her, and the silence was a sanctuary. She took a slow sip of tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. She simply watched the tide, ready to welcome the life that would soon share this quiet world. Months had passed since the day she arrived at the coast, and the rhythm of the tides had become the heartbeat of her new life. Amina spent her mornings walking the shoreline, her feet sinking into the wet sand, feeling the steady pull of the ocean. The ledger remained tucked away, a relic of a war she had already won by simply surviving. She sat on the porch as the evening air cooled, the scent of pine needles and salt heavy in the breeze. A sudden, sharp flutter against her palm drew her attention downward. She pressed her hand firmly against her stomach, feeling the unmistakable pulse of life beneath her skin. This movement was the only truth that mattered now. The fear that had once dictated her every step had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, ironclad certainty. She stood up, steady and upright, and walked back into the warmth of her home. The door closed behind her, sealing out the world. The echoes of the city and the cold chapel had faded into nothingness, replaced by the constant, grounding sound of the surf. Amina stood at the threshold of her porch, watching the first light of dawn bleed across the horizon. She thought of the ledger, now just paper, its power neutralized by the distance she had put between herself and the life she left behind. The transition from a target to a protector had been long, but the evidence of her success was in the steady, rhythmic breathing of the house around her. She reached down, touching the ground with her fingertips, feeling the solid reality of the earth beneath her feet. There was no more running. There were no more shadows to hide in. She looked toward the rising sun, her posture relaxed, her gaze clear. The life growing within her would never know the coldness of the chapel or the fear of the hunt. It would know the salt air, the sound of the tides, and the strength of a mother who chose to live. The story of the past was closed, and the story of the future was just beginning. She walked into the kitchen, started the fire, and embraced the quiet, beautiful weight of a life reclaimed. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm, golden light across the wooden floorboards of her sanctuary. Amina moved through the rooms with a deliberate, unhurried pace, checking the locks and windows not out of paranoia, but out of habit. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the wind against the glass. She walked to the center of the room and stopped, placing both hands flat against her stomach. There was no tension in her shoulders, no darting of her eyes toward the door. The hunt had ended months ago, yet the stillness of this morning felt like the first real moment of victory. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and watched the birds circling above the dunes. The world outside was vast and indifferent to the secrets she once carried, and she found comfort in that anonymity. She was no longer a piece in someone else's game. She was the foundation of a new life. She let the curtain fall, turned away from the window, and sat in the chair by the hearth. The fire crackled, a steady, rhythmic sound that filled the space with warmth. She closed her eyes, took a deep, slow breath, and finally allowed herself to rest. The cycle was complete. The silence in the house was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of peace. Amina stood by the hearth, watching the embers pulse with a dying, rhythmic glow. She reached out, tracing the grain of the wooden mantle, feeling the texture of a life she had built with her own hands. The shadows of the chapel and the frantic pace of the city were distant memories, blurred by the passage of time. She walked to the center of the room, her movements fluid and unhurried. There was no need to look over her shoulder. She stopped, placed a hand over her heart, and felt the steady, calm beat beneath her palm. It was the pulse of a survivor. She looked toward the darkened window, seeing only her own steady reflection, clear and resolute. She turned from the window, walked toward the bedroom, and left the remnants of her past in the cooling ashes of the fire. The final echoes of the past have faded into the quiet of the present. Amina stands in the center of her home, the air still and cool. She looks down at her hands, no longer trembling, no longer reaching for keys or hiding evidence. The ledger, the threats, and the cold gaze of her enemies are now nothing more than ink on paper, locked away in a history she has outlived. She walks to the doorway and steps out into the soft light of the morning. The path ahead is unmarked, free from the shadows that once chased her. She places a hand on her stomach, feeling the slow, steady movement within. This is the only truth that remains. She is the architect of a new beginning, a life defined not by what she lost, but by what she has secured. She takes a step forward. The wind carries the scent of the sea, clean and sharp. If you love powerful, real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.